my further to my earlier recording class on the word Bereshit bara Elohim, right? And the word Elohim being in the plural. I got a few comments from a few people. So, and the questions were good. The comments were good, and I thought worthy of addressing. So the basic tenor of all the comments was, well, if the word Elohim implies a multiplicity of gods, and understanding that, of course, it comes from a foreign language, from a polytheistic society where they believed in a multiplicity of God. So why not just, invent a new word? Why not, why use the word Elohim, right? Why not use some other word or invent a new word? Um, so that was part of it. Then another part of the line of questioning was, well, perhaps the word Elohim, multiplicity of God, is referring to multiplicity of attributes, right? So it's not talking about that there are many gods, but the one God has, many attributes. That would be, I guess, the best way to put it. So I want to address those two questions because they are important questions, and it's as follows. It's a question of strategy. The Torah, for whatever reason, and my father explains the reason in his book, Homo Mysticus, on the guide to the perplexed. For whatever reason, the strategy that God used was a particular strategy. He could have chosen a strategy which says, okay, the Jewish people are part of the pagan world, right? We come from pagan society. Um, and indeed, as the Gemara says in Masechet Megillah, so we came from a pagan society, and when we left Egypt, we had many of the pagan ideas and ideals within us. So a strategy that Hashem could have used could have been rather one which says just um, a complete yank away from that society, meaning everything that you have is zero, it's no good. Wipe the slate clean and start completely new. And now here are the new ideas which we are now going to set forth before you. And everything else is no good. That's a strategy that could have been used. The problem with that strategy is that when you yank someone away, let's even say in a violent manner, there are always going to be repercussions to that yanking away. You can't just yank somebody away in a traumatic fashion and expect that there will be no repercussions. There will be repercussions. But that's not the strategy that the Torah utilized. Rather, the Torah utilized a strategy which says there are certain concepts and symbols. We're not going to try to yank you away from those concepts and symbols, because if we do that, there will be traumatic consequences. And as I said, my father explains what those consequences are in his book, Homo Mysticus. But let's look now at the other strategy that was actually chosen by God. That strategy says there are certain concepts and symbols. Rather than yank away the Jewish people from those concepts and symbols, let's say in almost violent fashion, let's reconstitute those symbols. Let's vacate the symbols from their original meaning and give those symbols new meaning. I'll give you an example. Korbanot. Did the pagans bring korbanot? Yes. And did the pagans have certain rituals that at the visual level may be considered to be similar in some ways to some of the rituals that were done in the Beit HaMikdash? Correct. That's true. So Hashem doesn't say, I'll yank you away from that, but rather Hashem says, okay, let's keep some of those rituals. Let's keep the idea of korbanot, but we will vacate the symbol gradually and implant in it new meaning. and new content. So Hashem uses those very symbols that already occupy our psyche as a way to carry forth the message of the Torah, right? That's a much more pleasant experience. It's a far less traumatic experience. So a good example is the word Elohim. Yeah, we could have said, forget about everything you know and everything you heard. We're going to start something new. No, the word Elohim stays. They're all familiar. That's why they said God. They said the way they said God is they saying the way Elohim. Now, I use the English word God. Is it a perfect word? I mean, it may also have some connotations, but it doesn't make a difference. That's the word that I use. Not because I once gave a class in Israel in Ra'anana when I first moved to Ra'anana. I have to share this story. So when I first moved to Ra'anana, I was in an Ashkenazi synagogue, and I think somebody in the synagogue heard me speak, and he invited me for Hoshana Rabbah in the Sukkah, and there was all of that. The Ashkenazi congregants were there from the Sukkah, because I spoke English, so, many of the rabbis, they spoke Hebrew, and here's an English speaker, so he invited me to the Sukkah to speak on Hoshana Rabbah, and I gave a class on Perashat Ha'azinu, which I think was actually a beautiful class. I think it was a beautiful class because when I gave the same class in Brooklyn, only a year earlier, I got very enthusiastic replies from the audience. I get the exact same class. Maybe it was even a little better. I'm in Israel, and I'm inspired. I used the word Lord in the class, and it was just too much for them. They were like, later on, people, nobody commented on the class on, the content or what I spoke about or the Perushim on the Pesukim. It was an obsession, and I would say, perhaps a compulsive obsession. How could he have used the word Lord, right? So they use word, sometimes you have Elohim and Amonai, and I use Lord for one and God for the other, but it doesn't make a difference. The point is, there is this hyper obsession with the Gentile content. Well, yes, I mean, if you think of Jesus, when I say the word Lord, that's quite offensive. But I was speaking to what I assume to be not just biologically and ethnically a Jewish audience, but intellectually and epistemologically a Jewish audience. I naturally assumed that when I use the word Lord, they would think of the Lord of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I was mistaken. That was not the case. My mistake. Now, getting back to the idea of Elohim, God says, I'm not going to get rid of the word Lord or God or Elohim, but rather, don't forget, these words are symbols, sounds, right? So there is no relationship between the signifier and the signified, the sound and that which the sound points out to. And the sound used to point out to that which is being symbolized is an arbitrary sound. You can always vacate the meaning of the sound and give it a new meaning. So the strategy that the Torah uses is exactly that strategy, right? I would say that, and this is in one of my father's articles from the 70s, and he discusses how in the Sephardic communities, this particular strategy was used extensively. Because when you're a Jew living in the Galut, you're always going to be exposed to the Goy culture. And these symbols from the Goyim will inevitably penetrate one's mind. So there's two ways to deal with this. And many of the Ashkenazi communities had a particular strategy, which was to build walls and say, anything that comes from the Goyim is pasul, and we reject it completely. And that strategy, sometimes it worked, but when it didn't work, it would lead to an extreme. It would be either you're completely, within the walls created by the Jewish, let's call it intellectual ghetto, for lack of a better word, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, or be outside the walls, but there's no in between, and therefore it's an extreme choice, and it's an extreme way to live. And it worked for them in many, many cases, and in other cases perhaps it didn't work. But the strategy that the Sephardic community used was a different strategy, was to have open walls and to allow those symbols to come in. But rather than reject the symbols, they took the symbols and they vacated those symbols from their original meaning and gave it a Jewish meaning. So, for example, in Andalusia, in Spain, under the Muslim caliphates, and during the golden age of Spain, when things were really quite good for the Jews before the Al-Muhadin took over Spain. So things were quite good. Now, in the Muslim culture, there was just a lot of emphasis on beauty, and the beauty was expressed in incredible Arabic poems written by the Muslim um, songwriters, or poets rather, and they would write these beautiful poems, beautiful prose. And he said this shows that the Arabic is the most beautiful language in the world, because no other language in the world can describe things in such eloquence and beauty and precision and balance and rhyme and rhythm. All right. So what did we do? Rather than tell people, oh, you can't listen to songs. No, no, no. Poetry is forbidden. No. We had our poets wrote beautiful poems in Hebrew, which followed the Arabic rhythm and that Arabic beauty, right? So it took the outer shell, but it gave it Jewish content, right? Many of the songs we sing on Yamim Noraim are from those songs, right? Shlomo ben Gebirol, Moshe ben Ezra, Alayhim Shalom, Great Hachamim, right? Shemuel HaNagid and others, they wrote these songs, right? So you see the strategy? The strategy that the Torah uses is very analogous to the strategy used by Hachmei Sefarad. And my father describes this in his book, Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Hazan, in the introduction to the book. He goes at length and he describes this strategy used by the Sephardic communities, and I would submit to you, used as well by the Torah. And that's the idea of Elohim. That's point number one. Point number two. And again, several people made this point, so it's not one person, but several people, is as follows. Multiplicity of attributes. Rambam discusses this in the Monei Nebuchim, and it's very important to understand that when we say Hashem Echad, we don't only mean that there is one God. Yes, there is one God, of course. But we also mean that there is no multiplicity within this one God, right? So this one God, whatever, whatever he is, right? And that's, wow, that's like deep, deep. I mean, that's like going down the rabbit hole. I mean, in the first part one of the Moreh Nebuchim, that's like really deep stuff. Like it's so deep that Harambam keeps saying Amok. This is deep. This is Amok. We say it like more deep. So it's like you can really go down the rabbit hole. I'm not going to even like talk about what is God. What is that attribute? What is that? I can't even talk about it. So obviously in a public YouTube video, I can't talk about it. But the point is, there was a single unitary attribute to God. There's no multiplicity of attributes. So you can't, no, so Elohim doesn't refer to the multiplicity of attributes of God. But what there is, and I just want to kind of like, I don't want to stop there. There is a multiplicity of actions, right? So there are many, 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 many things that God created in the world, right? And this beautiful language that we call the universe, which we can read and enjoy the splendor of God's creations. Of course, that's infinite in its expanse and scope and depth. It's infinite, but it's not God's attribute. It's God's actions, and that's important because the action is separate from the actor, right? And we said this in the previous video that was just posted a few minutes ago on YouTube, class 61 on the golden doves. I explained that, right? So distinguish between attributes and actions. Yes, the actions of God are infinite, but that's not God's attributes. God is single. Hashem Echad, Ushmo Echad, means God in his essence, if we could even use that word, is a single. There's a singular essence, and that's a subject not for for this. So I did want to address those questions because, as I said, they were good.